Someday love will find you, break those chains that bind you. Hello everyone, and welcome back. We are basically finishing up Clone Conspiracy, right? I think we did the last video and we're like, you know what? Instead of dragging this on for another week, let's just exit right now. Let's just get it done and out of the way, right? So we can kind of move on to the really cool stories like when the Green Goblin became Carnage. Yes, the Green Goblin became Carnage in Marvel Comics. And it was amazing. Okay, so we are opening things up here with basically a Spider-Man just fleeing for his life, being chased by what are in effect zombies, only for us to find out this is Scarlet Spider, i.e. Kane. Now, who is Kane? Okay, so Kane, as we talked about in the last video, appeared in what was the original Clone Saga, but unlike Ben Reilly, who was more in line with like the life philosophies of Peter Parker, right? Like not killing if he doesn't have to, Kane was a dick. This guy was like the Punisher, man. This dude would kill people with no real reservation, right? This guy was pretty hardcore. And really, if I'm being honest, I think it's one of the things that always kept him popular in Marvel Comics. He was an answer to the question, what if Spider-Man became the Punisher, right? In a lot of ways he was. Maybe not necessarily as like horrible as the Punisher, especially if you read Punisher Max, right? We need to get back on that when we finish Invincible over at Patreon, because God, man, you know, this is one of those things where Kane was always kind of an anti-hero type Spider-Man, right? And people love that. The problem is he's kind of running through this strange universe where everything's popping off, only for him to wake up and kind of be met with quote unquote their guest, who of course is looking for their pills. Now, as far as the pills go, that'll be explained here in a minute. Instead, what we do is we actually switch back over to Peter Parker inside the New U facility, of course, being attacked by Dr. Octopus and Gwen Stacy. Now, the biggest issue here is what's going on with Gwen Stacy and what's going on with Dr. Octopus. The Dr. Octopus has in effect returned. We're not given a definitive answer in terms of how he's actually been able to do it, but one of the things here is that he recalls everything. And so when Peter Parker looks at this from the perspective of the fact that Dr. Octopus may very well be a clone, in his mind, his knowledge of clones goes back to the Clone Saga, where they have kind of a limited memory because they're duplicates of a particular person, but they don't really know the kind of ins and outs of what their life should be, in the sense that Dr. Octopus, if he is a clone, would have limited memory because there's no way Jackal could know everything about the life and times of Dr. Octopus, right? Duplicating genetic memory is a virtually impossible thing to do. And so because of that, he's kind of like, okay, there's something off here, right? Because when he challenges the knowledge of Dr. Octopus, he says, no, I remember everything from the time that I took over your body in Superior Spider-Man to the time that you told me you were from my future in Spider-Verse, and I learned you were eventually going to get your body back, right? To the point that I eventually died and then took over the body of a computer system using technology from the future in Marvel 2099, right? The home reality of Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, right? Using that technology, developing a body for myself, right? You know, the living brain. He's like, I remember everything, right? I am Dr. Octopus. Like, I am the Otto Octavius that you know. The problem is, even with this, it kind of stretches the limits of credulity, because he's like, I don't know how in the world you could possibly be back. Enter Miles Warren, the Jackal. The crazy thing about this is it looks like there's three of them, right? There's literally the Jackal who's kind of running the show, and then there's two other versions of Miles Warren, which is kind of wild, right? It's kind of a crazy thing. But with Gwen Stacy able to kind of talk Peter Parker down a little bit, then it turns into, okay, let's find out what's actually going on here, right? And so what we're really given here, the way that the Jackal presents this to Peter is, it's not really one of these things where the Jackal's looking to clone people for the sake of just like messing up people's lives or causing problems. He's actually looking to do some genuine good in the world. One of the first things he does here, which is probably the wrong thing to do, is he basically presents Spider-Man with all the villains who have died at the hands of Peter Parker, or by virtue of Peter Parker's actions, right? But all these different villains who have been killed over the years. And it's kind of nuts because he's kind of like, why in the world would you bring all these guys back? Like, you know, like Peter Parker immediately expects a fight, right? Like he's immediately expecting a fight to break out. And it's just kind of like, okay, all right, let's do this, right? Let's do this right now. And of course, they're kind of like, look, man, we're not really here to fight, you know, we're not really here to cause problems, man. Like, we're just kind of here. We're just kind of glad, you know, that Jackal brought us back. Why are you trying to start stuff, man? That's basically their response. Right now, in the middle of this whole thing, when the Jackal basically reveals that because of the fact that they've been brought back as clones, in order to keep the villains from just running out amok in the world and just causing all kinds of problems, that they basically have to pop pills in order to keep their bodies from breaking down. The way Jackal describes it, they're on a kind of chemical leash. But so long as Jackal is the sole person that holds their pills, they have to come to him, which means they have to do whatever he says. And in this instance, he's saying, don't go tear up the world, right? Just basically, hang out out around here and just do what I tell you to. But in the middle of this whole thing, everything pops off, and immediately Captain Stacy, the father of Gwen Stacy, is like, okay, you thought of every single last detail, right? And Miles Warren is like, yes. And he's like, here's the problem, man. That's not my daughter, Gwen Stacy. I know my daughter, Gwen Stacy, anywhere. That's not her. What have you done with her? Only for us to find out it's Spider-Gwen, man. What a great change, right? It's Spider-Gwen, right? Gwen Stacy from Earth 65, who basically gained the powers of a spider instead of Peter Parker. It's amazing. Spider-Gwen's a character who should never have been popular in the first place, right? Here's the funny thing about this. Spider-Gwen gained popularity not because of her stories, right? Her story was Edge of Spider-Verse. It was kind of cool, right? Not a whole lot going. What made her popular was the costume. That's what made her popular, right? Like her spider suit. It made her like one of the most popular things ever. After that, like she was cosplayed everywhere. You guys remember that when Spider-Gwen first came out in Edge of Spider-Verse? And you went to like New York Comic-Con and San Diego and Emerald City and C2E2, and like everybody was cosplaying as Spider-Gwen. That's what made her popular, right? Now, her stories are great, but it was the art that really set her off and made her into a really cool character. Of course, she's basically here. Peter Parker's like, oh, awesome, cool. The last time we teamed up, we were fighting the Inheritors, but she's basically a good guy. Let's get out of here. So they basically escape. The Lizard's sent after them, and then we basically pick up with Kane, only to find out that he's actually the one that has the cloned Gwen Stacy, the one that was brought back by Miles Warren. Of course, he's got her all tied up and everything, but he reveals, and when the question's asked, why aren't you bringing in Peter Parker on all this, right? I mean, if Spider-Man is the hero here and you and Spider-Gwen are basically working together, she's, well, at least was, basically pretending to be Spider-Gwen at the New U facility to gain information, why aren't you guys telling Peter Parker about this? And he says, because we've seen this whole thing happen, right? This whole clone conspiracy, we've seen all this happen, we've seen all of it play out in different universes across the multiverse, and it all ends the same way. Peter Parker allies himself with the Jackal, New U and Parker Industries go global, they end up unleashing what is in effect the carry-on virus, and they basically kill the world. And that's kind of the nuts thing here, right? Now, a lot of you guys are probably asking, what in the hell is the carry-on virus? Okay, so what you end up learning here is that the carry-on virus, and honestly, there's been like 5 different versions of the virus. Originally, Miles Warren was an employee or a guy who worked for the High Evolutionary, who's basically a guy that literally uses evolution to just speed up the process of growing life and things like that. He's super smart, right? Like Herbert Wyndham's super smart. He's capable of all kinds of cool stuff. He's usually a villain, sometimes he's a hero, right? It really kind of depends. But the first carry-on virus, like pretty much all the other versions that came after, while it did have different origins in terms of who created it or how it was synthesized or what have you, it all basically serves the same purpose. It turns people into effect living corpses. Now, how it works here is a little bit different than what you've seen in different carry-on viruses over the years in Marvel Comics, but basically the carry-on virus is the result of New U and Peter Parker working together, allowing the whole thing to kind of spread across the world and then basically killing all life on that world. Now, the idea of cellular degradation, it all kind of starts out as basically people who are clones. They eventually become carriers, their bodies break down, but during the cellular degradation process, they become infectious and they infect other people, and those other people end up becoming carry-ons. Now, ultimately, the entire process will break down, right? It'll all basically end and the world will basically die, but it's one of these things where Spider-Man basically kills the world in all these different universes that Kane and Spider-Gwen have been in, which is why they're not bringing him in, because their fear is if they tell him what's going on, that he'll ultimately end up siding with New U Technologies, or it might send him on the path of doing it and basically solidify the end of the world in the main Marvel universe, right? So what they end up doing is basically calling a woman by the name of Chief Anderson, right? Chief Anderson kind of working with the cops, the one that's handling all the New U stuff, and she's like, cool, we'll respond, only for us to find out she's actually part of New U. She's popping the pills to keep her cells from breaking down. She's a clone. And so what you end up doing is picking up with the Jackal back at New U headquarters as they kind of transition and he kind of shows Peter Parker what's going on. There is this thing called like the ultimate prototype, right? This kind of ultimate clone body that they don't really do anything with, to be honest. You don't really see much of it play out in this particular story, but it's one of these things where you have like Spider-Gwen, you've got Peter Parker trying to figure out what's going on, trying to meet with Kane, only to find out that Horizon University is under attack. They get there, but along the way, Peter keeps asking, Spider-Gwen, what's going on here? How come you guys never brought me in? And she keeps dodging the question. She won't give him a definitive answer. And so finally, she dumps it to him, right? Because she knows Peter Parker well enough to know that he's going to stop asking and he's going to start demanding, right? He's going to start getting pissed off. And so her response is, okay, look, here's the deal, man. Like, here's what happened. Basically, everything that I just told you guys with regards to Kane. That's basically what she says. And the response of Peter is, no, that's never going to happen, right? But the problem is, she says, like, the Jackal in every one of these universes always finds a way. He always finds a way to basically get you to switch to his side. But in the midst of all this, in the aftermath of basically Electro, Rhino showing up to Horizon University, attacking everything, snatching snatching up the cloned Gwen Stacy, bringing her back. The response is, okay, we have to launch a strike against New You, and they're met by the arrival of the Kingpin. Now, the whole reason why the Kingpin's here is because what had happened prior to this, during the events of Before Dead No More, is you ended up learning that the Jackal had approached the Kingpin and basically looked to have him work directly with the Jackal because of the Kingpin's resources. And he had done this, or at least tried to get this to happen, by basically bringing back Vanessa, right? The long dead wife of Wilson Fisk. Wilson Fisk immediately killed the clone and was like, you are now my mortal enemy. I will do everything I can to destroy you. Now, the reason why the Jackal did this is because the Jackal, the smartest thing he could have done here is exactly what he did do. When he basically started going through and kind of approaching people who were in high positions of power, government officials, members of the press, right? What you would normally expect billionaires to do and kind of buying off these different members of society, the Jackal had actually done that by using what was in effect emotional blackmail, by approaching these guys and basically saying, here's the deal, I will resurrect your loved one, right? I will bring your loved one back to you, or I will do this for you, or do that for you, or something along those lines, but you will owe me, right? And that's how he basically ended up developing all these people in powerful positions that could essentially make things happen for him. Now, the funny thing about this is that this kind of revelation to a degree with regards to Peter Parker hasn't necessarily come yet. Instead, you end up having Peter meeting with the Jackal, or at least intercepting a meeting between the Jackal and a few guys based on information given to him by the Kingpin. And when he arrives on the scene, a fight breaks out. The funny thing about this is the Jackal's able to outmaneuver and basically evade Peter Parker in seemingly every way. In fact, they're fighting at a dead even keel. And it's kind of nuts because Peter's like, no, something isn't right here, right? Like you're not the Miles Warren that I remember, right? The Jackal was, I mean, he was capable, but he was never on my level in terms of speed, durability, being able to punch me that hard. He was never ever on this level. Who are you really? And that's when the Jackal removes his helmet, and it's Ben Reilly. It's Ben Reilly Spider-Man. It's the other clone of Peter Parker. Now this is the crazy thing, right? This is a crazy thing, because while we're not explicitly told in this story how it happened, here's how Ben Reilly ends up becoming basically the Jackal, ends up leading the whole thing, right? So the idea here is that because Ben Reilly was one of the clones of Peter Parker created by Miles Warren back during the original Clone Saga, that Miles Warren was kind of up to his old tricks again, right? Cloning people, different things like that. What he ended up doing was resurrecting, or basically cloning Ben Reilly, but his cells would break down at a rapid pace because he was trying to find a more effective way to develop clone bodies. And so essentially Ben Reilly was cloned and died over and over and over and over again. And so once Ben Reilly had basically become stabilized, Ben Reilly actually broke free and then took over and essentially knocked Miles Warren unconscious, and then cloned the Jackal, and then basically screwed with his mind the same way Jackal screwed with Ben Reilly's mind back during the original Clone Saga, and convinced both versions of Miles Warren that they actually work for him, that he's the one running the show. He was able to kind of modify their memories a little bit and different things like that, but that's why Miles Warren is basically not actually running anything. It's Ben Reilly. Now, the fact that Ben Reilly and them also have Kane at their disposal, all that kind of stuff going on, they're basically kind of doing their own thing, right? Kind of going forward and so on. But with Peter Parker kind of realizing, okay, this is Ben Reilly, he gets a bit of a reprieve. And a lot of this is really because of the fact that Peter wants to know what's actually going on, because Ben Reilly was very similar to himself. You know, Ben Reilly died in the arms of Peter Parker, right? Like he literally turned to dust and faded away. And so with these guys, it's one of these things where it's kind of like, okay, look, you're not a normal villain. It's one of these things where he's kind of like, I'm genuinely curious what's going on here. Like, I genuinely want to know what's happening. And so what ends up taking place here is that where Ben Reilly initially introduced Peter Parker to the underground, all the different villains that have been brought back, instead, what he actually ends up doing here is bringing him to a place called the Haven. Basically, all these people who have been brought back, you know, kind of there's the villain group, but this is basically kind of home for everybody who's been resurrected. And it's one of these things where he's like, I brought back Kirk Connor's wife and son, right? I've brought back a lot of the people that you know who have died. I brought back J. Jonah Jameson's wife. I'm not here for the purpose of just conquering the world by using subterfuge and things like that. I'm legitimately trying to do a good thing. Now, Peter's, really his huge reluctance to this is no, like I can't really get on board with this. And the crazy thing is the only reason Peter's even here is, yes, one part of it has to do with loyalty to the idea of Ben Reilly, but also because Ben said, we can bring back Uncle Ben. We can resurrect Uncle Ben from the dead, right? We can clone him and bring him back, and you can have him back in your life. We can even bring back the guy who killed Uncle Ben, so you can smack him around a little bit if you want to, right? But he's like, we can make the world right again. The funny thing about this is Peter, after seeing all this, and it's really more of his desire to just find out how deep it goes, right? It's more of like a recon mission than actually siding with Ben Reilly. If anything, he was just pretending. He's just like, no, you're not going to bring back Uncle Ben. And he's like, why wouldn't I bring back Uncle Ben? I have the technology to do it. He was like, if you were going to, you would have, because you are me. And Uncle Ben means as much to you as he does to me, right? So if you were going to bring him back, it would have been one of the first things you did. And you would have known, and like knowing me as you know me, you would have known Uncle Ben would have been the person to bring back, not Gwen Stacy. Because while it is cool to see her again, Uncle Ben's return could get me to do almost anything. He's like, but at the end of the day, I know why you wouldn't do it. Because Uncle Ben would look at you the way that Uncle Ben only could and tell you you're wrong. Yes, you have the means to do it, but you don't have any responsibility here. And with great power must come great responsibility. Standing in the face of Ben Reilly like that and just being like, I was never going to be a part of this, right? I was never going to join you on this. I just wanted to see how deep it goes. Kind of revealing this here, Ben Reilly realizes that Peter Parker is never going to join his side. And so in response, Ben Reilly's like, kill him. And everybody goes after Spider-Man, right? Everybody starts attacking him. And that's the crazy thing, because at that point, Hobie Brown, while he is technically a clone and he is kind of under the service of the Jackal, he still has a measure of free will, right? It's not really mental control so much as it is, you got to take my pills, otherwise you're going to die. So as a result of that, Hobie Brown, the Prowler, who of course was basically not really the sidekick, well, kind of the sidekick of Spider-Man at one point in time, ends up helping him kind of face off against the various villains. And then you end up having Jackal, who basically leaves and goes to speak with Anna Marconi, and goes to speak with like Electro and Dr. Octopus and those guys. Now, one thing to keep in mind, Anna Marconi's not sided with the Jackal. She was basically brought here, right, against her will. But it's one of these things where you basically have her in a kind of revelation with Dr. Octopus, where as much as she despises him now because of the fact that he's a villain, that he realized, okay, so whenever any of the clones step outside the facility of New You, they start breaking down at a much faster pace. Why? Because there's some kind of a radio signal out there that basically breaks them down, right? Maybe it's FM radio, maybe it's AM radio, maybe it's just some kind of part of the light spectrum. Whatever it happens to be, it forces them to break down faster, which is why they break down slower when they're here. And he's like, so if there is a radio signal out there that speeds up the breakdown process, then there's got to be a signal that slows it down, right? That could almost bring it to an end. And so that's when the two of them are kind of talking, and they're like, okay, Anna Marconi's like, I figured it out, right? When Miles Warren's here, she's like, I figured out how to stop the entire breakdown process to completely end it. Now, in response to this, the Jackal's like, if you give me that information, because Marconi's like, she's not readily going to give it to him. When he's like, if you give me this information, I will give you this ultimate clone body, right? We'll put you in a body that's not diminutive, right? That's rid of any defects, things like that. Now, one of the best things about Anna Marconi is she's like, I don't want that garbage. She was always like a really confident woman, right? Highly intelligent, highly confident, and didn't really need to like feel satisfied, right? I mean, she had basically been satisfied with herself. She's like, I know what I'm capable of. I know what I'm about. I don't need to be in a body of a quote unquote big person in order to feel like I'm making an impact on the world. I'm literally smarter than you are, right? So if anything, you need to get on my level, bro. Good for you, girl, right? Good for you. But nonetheless, because of the fact that the Jackal makes this offer to Anna, it pisses off Dr. Octopus, who immediately goes to attack him, and then he realizes that the Jackal is not actually Miles Warren, that it's Ben Reilly, because of the fact that his spider sense alerts him and allows him to react proactively to the tentacles of Dr. Octopus. And so he's like, okay, that's when it all starts popping off, because while everything's going on, right? Spider-Gwen shows up, she's trying to rescue Kane, she's kind of a distraction. Dr. Octopus is like, no, we're destroying everything that you care about. And so he ends up amplifying the signal that speeds up the cellular degradation of the clones throughout the entirety of the New You facility, and literally all these clones start dying and breaking down. The problem with this is how it begins. That when a person physically touches somebody who is in possession of the carry-on virus, that they basically become a carrier themselves, right? They become infected by it. It's not like a zombie infection where you have to be bitten. All you have to do is be touched, and that's the end of it, right? That's enough of it. That's how Kane ended up looking the way that he does, is because in one of these alternate realities, when he was looking to escape from the carry-on plague as it was spreading throughout that world, he was just touched by somebody with the carry-on virus, right? Now, the spider abilities, his healing factor, that kind of thing kind of helps keep it at bay. And even then, he has to kind of keep himself doped up in order to keep the virus from completely overtaking his body. But this is how it spreads. The biggest problem with this is that the signal is basically amplified across the world. And so because of that, with the Jackal using his ability to take what Dr. Octopus has done and spread it across the world, he knows that all these people who are clones are going to start breaking down, and they're all basically going to start dying, and people are going to start touching them, and they're going to turn into carry-ons themselves. And as crazy as this idea is, the whole purpose of Jackal is to basically kill the world and then recreate it in a day, right? Which he could feasibly do. Now, the most likely scenario here is it wouldn't play out that way, because that's what he tried to do in other universes, and it never worked the same way, right? It never played out the way that they wanted it to. It basically just led to the carry-on infection running rampant throughout the planet, and there was no real discernible way to stop it. And so because of that, Peter's kind of like, okay, right? Spider-Man's like, all right, I'll do what I can, but at the end of the day, he's just got to watch all these people kind of break down and die. There's not really a whole lot he can do here, right? Not much aid he can offer. But instead, what ends up happening is that he's like, okay, Anna Marconi's a person I got to talk to. I need to get to her so we can figure out a solution here. Gwen Stacy, despite the fact that she's basically breaking down after being told by her father, Captain Stacy, look, Peter's a good guy, right? Peter has always been a great guy. You have to help him however it is that he needs help. And ultimately, it's really the dying thing that Gwen Stacy does is get Peter Parker to safety. And she also ends up shutting one of the doors and then basically, you know, killing a bunch of the villains that are clones in order to buy Peter Parker time. So she literally sacrifices her life against like the Hobgoblin and Jack-o'-lantern and the Green Goblin. She kills them all just to basically save Peter Parker, which is kind of nuts. And Peter Parker, along with Spider-Gwen and Kane, all end up kind of banding together a little bit. Right now, at that point, Peter finds Jackal and immediately goes to attack Ben Reilly. But in the middle of all that, Anna Marconi's like, no, we don't need you fighting Jackal, right? We don't need you fighting Ben Reilly. Dr. Octopus can handle him, right? He's fought you a zillion times before. Ben Reilly's really no different than you, except he doesn't really have any web shooters. So at the end of the day, Dr. Octopus can handle him. I need your brain. And that's when Peter realizes you found a way to reverse the signal. And so what ends up happening here is because of the fact that Parker Industries is essentially just this giant worldwide corporation that makes Peter Parker richer than Tony Stark, one of the things they developed was webware, right? Which is essentially a Marvel Comics equivalent to like iPhones, iWatches, all that kind of stuff, right? Apple products. That's really what Parker Industries is in a lot of ways. They have a more expansive reach than Apple does, right? They're not just a technology corporation that delves in like computer technology, and that's basically it. They've got a much larger reach than that. Unlike Apple, they actually care about people. So the important thing here is that Peter basically ends up really traveling to the news station where J. Jonah Jameson was at, which was hijacked by the Jackal in order to broadcast this signal across the world and kind of speed up this cellular degradation, right? Because it's one of these things where, again, when you touch somebody with the carry-on virus, you're infected by it and your cells start breaking down. So at this point, it's not really a matter of saving clones. I mean, they kind of can, but it's really more of just saving everybody else. And so using the technology of webware and basically sending out the reverse signal, which essentially slows down and eliminates cellular breakdown, they're basically able to save pretty much everybody out there. Any clone or anybody who is who's been touched by a carry-on, who's not breaking down or who's only just started breaking down, essentially survives. For a lot of them out there, they're dead, right? There's not really a whole lot that they can do here. Everybody's kind of gone. The other big thing is that Dr. Octopus actually ends up just wrecking the entirety of the facility while he's fighting Ben Reilly, and just has like this whole lash out moment, right? He's like, you know, like what you've done here almost cost my Anna her life, right? This is huge because it's a testament to how much Dr. Octopus loved Anna Marconi, right? How much he cared about her, that he's like, okay, like I'm destroying it all, right? I mean, in the end, he is also kind of breaking down himself. And so he's like, okay, he basically like crushes, destroys the whole thing. It all basically explodes. And he's like, melt with me. And it's just like, that's it, right? It basically ends up, he ends up taking out Ben Reilly and himself in the process, so that all that's left is basically just the little ashes and remains of Dr. Octopus, and Ben Reilly's basically gone, right? All the clones are essentially eliminated here. And so what you end up getting here is this revelation from a woman by the name of Dr. Clarkson, and who basically ends up bringing in like Spider-Man and Anna and Kane and all these different guys, and basically says, look, like here's the thing that was going on, right? Like I thought that Ben Reilly was actually doing some good work, right? I didn't realize that he really had aspirations for doing villainous stuff, despite the fact that Jackal has historically been a villain of Peter Parker. Common sense, people, it's time to use it. But she's like, we thought he was actually doing good things, right? But what she says here is that not everybody out there that had basically been killed was brought back as a clone under the Jackal. For some of them, we were actually able to restore them a little bit, right? You know, procedures, different things like that. We were able to kind of bring them back. Not everybody. And the cloning procedure was used really more by Ben Reilly to solidify a position of power, even if he didn't want to openly admit it, right? But she's like, some of the people we were able to bring back, not a whole lot of significant people here. Jerry Saltaris is one of them. But one thing I will say, do not forget about that ultimate clone body, because it has not been destroyed and it will return in a really cool way. But with that being said, guys, this is Clone Conspiracy. It's a lot that happens in a 5-issue series, but it's the Clone Conspiracy. It's really good. I always really enjoyed it. I always thought it was a lot better. But the Spider-Man stories, is as cool as this is, honestly, I consider it to be one of the weaker Spider-Man stories, at least under Dan Slott. What comes after this gets amazing, especially when Green Goblin becomes Carnage. God, it becomes absolutely awesome. Anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.